Okay, so I think, welcome to this, which is absolutely an experiment, really is. Every time that I got on a call with the other people on the organising sort of committee for this event, everyone was saying, I've never ever been to an event which possibly is quite like this. And I think in the UK, definitely we are, this is the first sort of event of its kind. It actually, has been a previous sort of incarnation of these sorts of things that's done in the States. Out of Oklahoma, they run this thing called the Virtual Residency Program. And that's actually its 7th year. So we're building on 7 years of their experience, but it's well worth going to their website and looking at some of those videos around what we're actually trying to do here as well. So, but everything, apart from maybe the death by PowerPoint, we risk a little bit on this first day just to set the scene of various things. Everything in this program is sort of brand spanking new, which means that your questions, your input, and all this, you will be basically helping us pioneer a new way of developing the next generation of digital research infrastructure professionals. Wow. And actually, this is, repeating what Nikki just said. It's really down to you, really, in making this, a good thing or a bad thing, right? Please do ask questions, right? The dumb questions are the ones that you don't ask. Do volunteer your ideas and experience. We have a lot of experienced people in the room. And you'll see this within the program, when we've come up with the panels, we've sent Google Docs out to people and said, edit these, right? Make it yours, make it better. Ultimately, it is you who will be in charge of this event, not really us, he says. And so much so that you'll see a kind of unconference bit, this intentionally left blank bit in the schedule. So, being a digital research infrastructure professional, right? Okay, for lots of the topics, there's not a single way of doing it. And we haven't really defined what the topics really are. There's some stuff around broad topic theme areas, but who are the experts? And I don't think there's one expert that knows everything about everything in this space. And most of people's experience depends upon the context in which they operate. So you'll notice that after today, everything is panel based. And we pulled some people together to sort of sit up here and sort of share a few ideas, but there's going to be loads of additional perspectives that are in the audience as well, which we want to learn from as well. Okay, so this is all about learning from each other. So, who are these digital research infrastructure professionals? And you might know them by some of these terms and who they supposedly face, but you might say, I actually do all those things, right? At some point in my career, I've kind of done most of those jobs, but I've been termed different things. Elements of the role of researcher facing, some are kind of system facing, some face data, some face software, some sort of face much more sort of stakeholders and management. So we're talking about kind of people who sit sort of at the intermediary between research and computational technologies. So, what is a DRI professional? Okay, they work with users, researchers, and educators to help them improve their research and/or education productivity and aspirations by advanced digital technologies. And sometimes, in some organisations, there's great swathes and teams of these people. If it's a particularly mature kind of setup. Other times there's a lone research computing guy, right, who's basically got everything to do. These people come from lots of different backgrounds, okay? Some are actual academics doing it kind of on the side, current, or maybe they were former academics that got into sort of doing this because they knew a little bit about computing alongside their research. Sometimes they're postdoctoral research fellows, sometimes they're research staff, sometimes they're IT professionals coming from sort of enterprise IT operations, or graduate, undergraduate students. It's really is quite mixed. But I think it's important to know that, a DRI professional is not necessarily a computer scientist. And I think a lot of people probably here and online, probably not many of those people actually come from a computer science kind of background. And they're not necessarily kind of a sysadmin kind of role. Often the person who runs the supercomputer or whatever ends up in this kind of role. That's the automatic person that you maybe think of. But actually, as the teams grow, actually most DRI professionals aren't, right? Especially if you look at sort of the research software engineering kind of movement. So what do? We work directly with sort of STEM faculties and non-STEM researchers, advancing their compute-intensive and data-intensive aspects of their kind of research or creative activity. And really we're about amplifying researcher productivity. Do things such as adapting workflows to the various systems that are kind of out there, bridging between researchers and the kind of technology experts, anticipating, what do we need to do in order to give a new capability to a particular research group in terms of anticipating new and emerging computing needs for research, helping people do coding or refactoring or teaching them how to do coding in particular areas, putting sort of specific kind of examples or use cases together, and more recently all sorts of things about how to do research whilst taking into account lots of kind of cybersecurity elements, so how to be, do safe and secure research with computational technologies. There is there's loads that we do. The whole specific use case development, teaching data management, looking at what training is out there and bringing those to kind of the local user base, helping researchers evaluate new technology solutions, going out and actually finding new users, the potential people that will benefit from adopting some of these advanced technologies, being kind of that person who can advocate to administration, saying this is actually a really worthwhile investment. It is paying off. This is the sort of return, and this is why we need to keep putting money into this operation. Also, putting selected bits within particular publications, and outputs in terms of describing some of the kind of computational infrastructure or techniques that are being used within a particular piece of research, or even putting text within grant proposals that make it ultimately look like the researcher really knows what they're doing when it comes down to what technologies will be used. So we talk about kind of personal qualities of these people, and it's kind of like, well, actually, if you go most management training courses, there's two things that really matter in life. There's people and there's stuff, okay? And, really it's all about managing people and stuff. But I think there's this other axis within research computing that's really important, between technology on one side and research on the other. And you can see within this sort of kind of very magic quadrant, or we want to call it, that if you kind of like people and technology, then you might end up, say, in a service desk kind of role. If you like, really like things and research, then you're possibly going to end up as a researcher. If you're not so keen on the people side of things, then technology, in like sort of technology and stuff, then you may have got a good career as a systems engineer. But really, these digital research infrastructure professionals sit right at the intersection of kind of really liking the people, the research, the stuff, and the technology. And that's the kind of unique balance, I think, which we're trying to kind of address within this retreat. Who cares about us? Who cares? Well, actually, thankfully, some researchers, the ones that we help, actually really care about us. And I can testify to this, that when you help a user or a researcher achieve something they can't do before, they absolutely will be, fight your corner and have your back. And also, it isn't just down to that local thing. You can take it to the extreme and the sort of national leadership style stuff. and you look at various reports, and it doesn't just talk about investment in stuff to make us a kind of more kind of competitive nation. It talks about, you know, critical underpinning capability across all research, you know, but actually the important thing for enabling that is the people, and the skills and training is actually the critical enabler in this. And actually we've got a whole, we were very successful in getting, you know, EPSRC sponsorship for this. So they've kind of put their money where their mouth is on this one, and actually funded, and EPSRC have put forward the money to sponsor this this retreat. So here's an interesting one. So we could just, you know, send you all on an enterprise IT training kind of approach, but that possibly is a kind of a thing that might not work here, and I'll sort of elucidate why, and why we're taking this particularly this way of doing this. So if you think about the sector of enterprise IT workers, we've got millions of professionals there. Okay, we've got degree programs that prepare people through it for bachelor's, masters, PhDs, various certificates. There's all sorts of certifications around, you know, Red Hat certified engineer, Microsoft certified engineer, you know, BCS programs, and there's a lot of resources that are put there to constantly update skills in that, just because the market is so big. If we're talking about research computing and DRI professionals, we're talking about thousands of people, not millions. Okay, so there's no degree programs, there's no certifications, there's minimal resources for updating skills, and actually our informal education is kind of the best bet. So something like this, let's have a go, right, at doing this. So, hence this retreat. So, the grant was called something around sort of professional skills training for digital research infrastructure, professionals pilot program. But actually, I thought, we'll badge this as a digital research infrastructure retreat, because when we're talking about kind of soft skills and management skills and things like that, my management were always very, you know, very kind of enthusiastic about sort of sending you away for a week, getting you all brainwashed, come back, new person, you sort of, you know, you've now got the kind of ability to kind of all the soft skills needed in a kind of more managerial role or whatever it may be. So I thought, actually, let's try to pitch this idea of kind of taking a week out and just trying to invest in these things sort of ourselves in our community. So what are we going to try and do? We're trying to teach pre-service and in-service digital research infrastructure professionals how to do or do better research computing facilitation. There's actually a hidden agenda which I'll come to, but it's not very hidden, to be honest. But actually, if we look at what the EPSRC call was that gave us the money for this, I've just bolded out some of the things there where, you know, they want to additional utilization of the things that they've invested in, expanding user base, appealing to researchers outside of EPSRC remit, expansion of the user base, high quality services, these things. We felt that, yes, you could just go and buy a load of GPUs and kind of run a bit of an outreach program or whatever, but the thing that might make a big difference will be actually trying to get people more effective at supporting their local user community. So hence we pitched this professional skills pilot as a thing. It was all done in a hurry, and you'll find that a lot of things are done in a hurry. So we actually got the money in December 2021, and we've been rapidly just, you know, full throttle putting this thing together. I'm so we've got like 50 people from across the whole sort of the community that are actually coming and serving as panelists on this thing, which is, you know, brilliant. It's better than we probably would have thought it would be. So thank you so much for, you know, actually looking at seeing whether we're actually just totally done trying to even try this, or whether this actually might work. So, but, you know, why do it? You know, often DRI professionals have very strong experience within their discipline, which is often not computer science. Most of us have never been academic staff. We don't know what it's like to be academic staff. Sometimes there's actually little or no research experience. You know, how do we take somebody who's had absolutely no, they've not seen any research, but they're a really good technical IT person that would have skills that would be really good if they were kind of researcher facing, and teach them how to really engage with researchers. So I think that once these DRI professions are in post, they actually have to span a really wide range of research disciplines, communicating with people that, actually it's a totally different language with. And there's literally no program apart from the US virtual residency that does this. I was kind of lucky in that I started as a kind of user support person back in like maybe 20 years ago or something, and gradually worked my way, making lots of mistakes. Why did that work? Why did that not work over the years? Eventually became a director of research computing, and actually, that's kind of nice that I had that time to actually do that. Oftentimes, you will get someone that goes, someone will come into work one day and go, Jenny, you're going to be our research computing person, right? And they expect you to kind of hit the ground running. Right, and we need to help support. It's great when that happens, but we need to be able to support that. So who's here? Well, brilliantly, we have 225 people who've registered. We've got 107 people over the week that are coming. Not everyone's here every day. There's people coming and going, and a lot of people will probably do a bit of the meeting online, a bit in person. We've got 118 people that are purely remote, but we've got about 50 different institutions that have managed to send people here, which is fantastic. We've got over 50 speakers, and those are across about 25 institutions. So we did our best to make this not really an N8 event, it's an N8 facilitated event. Okay, so why is our job hard? Okay. If you think about it, it used to be just, the computational fluid dynamicists or whatever. We're kind of a very limited number of people used computational technologies in their research, or advanced ones anyway. If you think now that the variety of users that are on there, from like the performing arts to, they're all kind of, particularly in data intensive applications, there's a really wide breadth of advanced research computing need out there. Also, the kind of systems that are put in are getting harder and harder. They're getting a little bit, they're not obviously obvious to fathom. There's all sorts of different performance layers that are in there as part of the architecture, and somehow we expect our researchers to be able to kind of understand how their application actually performs on this thing, and why that's a good choice of platform, or why that isn't a good choice. And so we've got this kind of navigating complexity kind of problem, right? Whereas, the systems are much more complicated. And also, if I think about the way that my kids use computers nowadays, right? They seldom know how to, don't know. They'll try to speak into the mouse. It is, people are coming from sort of more like tablet kind of backgrounds and web-based approaches. And so if we think, 20 years ago, it was all about, getting people to use the command line, from kind of a Windows background. Actually, now we're talking about an even further kind of conceptual distance, because most people are coming from mobile devices. But remember, you only have an hour to really get these people on board, right? Or they're not going to actually, think that what you're doing is worthwhile and what you're telling is worthwhile. Because if you can't get it across to them in an hour, they need to sort of move from there to there, and it'll do them a lot of good. Forget it, right? So they only give you time. So here's what we've got, right? And I didn't expect this to be like the agenda that ended up being. This was like very much the one that I started for 10. This is obviously the kind of context kind of presentation, and we'll go on to sort of communication with Martin in a moment as part of that. But I think one thing that so we've got kind of themed days really, and I think really the interesting one is that we've actually put in this unconference session down here, because there may be like stuff that we should be discussing that we didn't even think of putting on this agenda. And so I I think what we're going to do, I think basically there's a bunch of big post-it notes around to kind of put ideas down around, if you're in the room, around the what we'd like to do within that unconference session. And also there online, I'm hoping there's going to be maybe a Google Doc or something put online that people can just edit and put their suggestions in. A link will be sent out within AirMeet so that we can construct that session. But that session, it's very much, let's see what happens, because we're very much going to make that one up on the spot. So, what are we going to learn? Hopefully from each other. Okay, we're going to learn how to work with researchers who are using the digital research infrastructure. We're going to learn how to find them. We're going to learn how to help them. And we're going to kind of start to be thinking about being institutional research computing leaders. Oh, that is probably the hidden agenda here, right? And actually thinking about being sort of national digital research infrastructure leaders. I mean, I remember going to my first community meeting around, I think it was maybe the Hector installation one time. And I was like, there's all these people doing this stuff, and it was kind of really kind of interesting that they were doing that. I did not realize that I would be part of a procurement of Archer 2, right? And there's so few people that do these roles. It's a very short kind of time between going from, oh, there's this people kind of that I see as the leaders, to actually being part of that leadership. I think also one thing that we thought was really essential is just, none of us have worn shoes to work for the last, 2 years, right? And I think the community has really, it needs to really start establishing some of the kind of more informal links across, people in similar situations, people can sort of informally mentor each other or whatever around this. So I think it was really important to actually have people getting together for this online and in person, because ultimately there's kind of a collective voice that is a little quiet, I think, at the moment. So what we're not trying to do, okay? So anybody who thought that we were going to get loads and loads of technical content, you're going to be really disappointed. There's loads of stuff out there, though, around technical stuff. But we're not going to focus on the technical stuff. But we are going to try to teach you what the profession is, even though none of us really know. We're going to come up with it, right? And we are actually going to sort of really help define what this is, this profession of kind of digital research infrastructure facilitation and leadership. And actually, if we look at it, there's more and more and more and more need for this within our research environments. Yet there's a kind of fewer and fewer people that are kind of around to kind of do it. So at the moment, the demand for this is sort of exceeding the supply of people that are actually there to kind of support this activity. So what we really need is to streamline this process, right, of getting people up and running quickly at being effective digital research infrastructure professionals. And there are good examples of sites and people that have done this. And those people have committed time to be here this week, which is great. But actually, I think people in this room, this is where we will find the kind of leaders of tomorrow, really through this kind of thing, being able to scale up these people that are required. So basically, you lot are next, okay, in terms of being our future leaders. And why wouldn't you want to be, right? An institutional digital research infrastructure leader. There's obviously some good, warm-hearted reasons. You've got a good, you really like, helping people, and you like being an advocate for them, and you think this gives you, makes you sleep well at night. But actually, there's also wicked selfish reasons, because obviously, you probably get a better paid job, and it might be higher job security if you're able to make these cases a lot more. Okay, and same with why be a national digital research infrastructure leader? Okay, yes, the national community would benefit from your keen insights. Okay, you've really good, warm-hearted reasons. You'll have a chance to influence the course of research history. Amazing. But there's also wicked selfish reasons, okay? Because you're getting noticed by other people, and that will advance your career, okay? So I'll just finish on this word before getting Martin up to talk about the comms side of things. I think, for me, yes, I think this is the best job ever, right? Because literally every day you get to see how the work you do helps other people to be successful. So that's the end of my torturous PowerPoint show. Any questions from in here or whilst we change over or online? Yeah. You need a microphone.
What is the link to the Google Docs?
Is Nikki in the room?
Yeah, we have a microphone. I can relay it.
Yeah, for those of you on AirMeet, you can't see me. I'm just a disembodied voice. Oh, hello. The guys at the front say they can't hear. Okay, better? Yeah. So for the people joining us on AirMeet, Martin Hamilton, our online facilitator, is going to set that document up and he'll post it into the chat or a link to it into the chat as soon as he can. So Martin Hamilton's on that.
Great, nice one, Martin. You might know Jamboard might also work for Post-it notes to collect all of the notes from the people in the room and from our online attendees, but Google Docs is fine with me.
Cheers, Paul. Is that a clicky button thing as well? Oh. There's a green button that says next. I'm assuming that's the one. Don't press the red button, exactly. Who knows what will happen? Right, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Martin Callaghan, University of Leeds. Hope everybody's fine. Got a nice little bit of a settle in there with Alan. Everybody's looking nice and relaxed. So I think we're going to start off. I'm going to start off with a couple of questions for you. So Alan's talked quite a lot about this sort of background and the sort of various job roles. But I think it might be interesting for all of us just to see how that's distributed across the audience today. So I'm going to ask you a few questions. How and what you identify as. And just ask you to raise your hand. And you can put your hand up for more than one category. That's okay. So helps me, helps all the other speakers identify what sort of people we've got in the room, but also helps you identify on your tables. I'm sure everybody said hello to each other, haven't they, and shook hands and introduced, and we all know who everybody is. So with that first category then, I had to write these down, I forgot.
Vote.
Sorry?
How do the online people vote?
So there is a chat, so they can just pop in the chat what category they are. Because I'm only going to ask 5 things.
Cool.
Okay, and we can just get a little bit of feedback from that. So of that first category, so who would regard themselves as a lecturer or other academic? So we've got a goodly number of academics, good. What about, just reading my own badge here, research software engineer or research infrastructure engineer? Ooh, we've got a lot of those, haven't we? Excellent. So that's the biggest category so far. What else is on my list? Who's a postdoc or a PhD student? Oh, we've only got a few of those. That's okay. Postdocs, PhD students. So that's a sort of research and research computing bit. Anybody here who might regard themselves as being part of enterprise IT in an institution? Technically. Okay, so half. Okay, if that's all right. And is there anybody I've missed out? Any other category? Oh, there's another category. So I might just grab one person to tell me what the other category they are. So
annoying manager type. Assistant director for research in IT service.
Assistant. So that's is that enterprise IT? No, it's not enterprise IT. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. So that gives us a bit of a feel of who we are. So the majority of us are from either an academic or a very research-focused research software engineering or research infrastructure engineering background, which I think from what Alan was telling us a little bit earlier on, is probably about right, probably the right audience. But it's good to see that, isn't it? It's good to see where we're from. So, as I say, I'm Martin Callaghan, University of Leeds. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of communications aspect to all of this and the difference in mindset, the difference in talking to people, the difference in understanding, particularly from our perspective, sort of research software engineering, research infrastructure engineering, the mindset of a researcher, which is subtly different to us. They're in quite a different position. And I think this should be a really nice lead on, Sarah, to your panel coming next, where there'll be a real opportunity to delve what it means into the sort of research and researcher perspective on all of this. So a few slides, and hopefully an opportunity for discussion as well. For those of you on Meet, if there are any things you want to raise, pop them in the chat, and I'll pop back to people who are on Meet themselves, and we'll get some feedback from people into the room as well. So we've got a bit of two-way interaction going on there. And if at any point I wave this over here somewhere and forget to speak into the microphone, I'm sure somebody on the front row will prod me and persuade me to move in the right direction again. Okay, next one. So I thought we'd start off just by discussing a little bit about what it means to talk to a researcher, and perhaps understanding a researcher's perspective and researcher's terminology. And in doing so, to explore a little bit about the gap in mindset from enterprise IT and research software engineering and research infrastructure engineering, and help us to understand and remember what it means to be in the perspective of a researcher, of an academic. Hopefully that will help us to understand what to say, perhaps more importantly how to say it to a researcher, and hopefully you're going to hear a little bit more about that and some very personal perspectives, nearly didn't get that word out, some personal perspectives from this next panel session. So, remember that not all researchers are the same, right? There are probably as many individual research domains in our universities as there are researchers. And every single one of them views the universe and views their domain in a slightly different way. Now that adds an awful lot of fun for us as research support professionals, but it does make the job quite difficult. And even within a research domain, language and terminology can differ wildly and between institutions. So here's a question. So this is a question that's often posed at the start of the retreats over in the States. Is oxygen a metal? Yes. Well, it's either yes or no, I'm not sure, or somewhere in between, isn't it? But the question, go on. The question is, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to ask you to say that because I think that is incredibly important.
Depends on who you're talking to.
It depends on who you're talking to. And all the way through this week, when we think about interacting with researchers, I want you to think about that comment. It depends on who you're talking to because all of these perspectives are different. So in response to that, is oxygen a metal? And some perspectives might be sort of oxygen in real life, atomic number 8, it's ore forming, it's a key element in life. That's how you and I'm not a chemist, I'm a computer scientist, more on what they are later on. So that's one interpretation of what oxygen is. But a second interpretation, very different in astronomy, as an astronomer, the universe is made of hydrogen and helium, and everything else is basically irrelevant. So that's another perspective. So your average astronomer couldn't care less what oxygen is. So, very bad joke. 3 researchers walk into a bar. A mathematician, a psychologist, and a film and media scholar. And they walk into a bar and start to discuss projection. Terrible joke. Thank you for laughing. Okay. You know, you can laugh at my jokes at any point. You don't need to be prompted. Thank you very much indeed. Projection. So projection, of course, means something entirely different if you're a mathematician, if you're a psychologist, and of course, if you work in film and media. And this is what we need to start to think about in more detail. So I'm going to pause at this point, just for a couple of minutes, and I'm going to ask you on your tables to come up with a situation where there was a mismatch in your understanding compared to a researcher's understanding of a particular term or concept. Okay, so again, if you're on Meet, you can pop some little ideas into the chat and we'll see if we can catch up on some of those. but as a little 3-minute warm-up and an opportunity to talk on your tables. So think of a situation where there was a mismatch in terminology, where you and the people you were talking to got the wrong ends of the respective stick. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to think about that, and then I'll grab a couple of tables, a couple of comments, to see if anyone can come up with some interesting little anecdotes. So this is more of a warm-up activity, just to get us talking to each other, to get us thinking, and we'll give ourselves 3 minutes. Right, okay, thank you very much. Time for a little bit of feedback. Hush. There we go. Thank you very much. So hopefully that got a little bit of interesting discussion going on. I am going to hand over first of all to Nikki, who's got a few comments in across on ERMEET, which I think were a good starter set of points. Over to you, Nick.
So we've got one here from Mathis, and I once had a chat with an astronomer about variables, which to me are algebraic quantities or parameters, but to them was a type of star.
There you go.
We managed to keep the two conversations going for surprisingly long. And I've got one other, which is from Penn Richardson in Manchester. Memory. I'm usually asking about RAM, but some researchers think I'm asking about disk space.
There you go, and that's the type of. It was interesting, the first comment there, and we kept the conversation going on for quite some time before we realised we were talking about two entirely different things. So that's the sort of accidental gap that we can sometimes engineer for ourselves. So I'm just wondering if we can pick on two tables that might be just prepared to give us an example each. So if you don't volunteer, I will volunteer you. That's okay. Oh, there we go. So did you volunteer, sorry, as well? No. You volunteered them. Okay, good.
Thank you.
Back again.
Right, I think it's quite an interesting one because we have sort of three perspectives, but and I think it's quite telling given the name of the event that we're at is infrastructure. So we've had a case where actually my university infrastructure means everything that includes estates and IT, through to this gentleman's interpretation of it meaning networks and computers, through to devices within a computer. So really, from very, very big things that cost hundreds of millions of pounds, through to things that cost the order of thousands or hundreds of pounds.
Oh, so there we go. Thank you very much for that one. Should we have one more voluntary table? Who should we go for? So Marion's looking very keen over there. So I think we're going to go over to Marion's table over here. We got a mic somewhere? Yeah, we can go to this table.
Yes, I work for academic library and archive. When we talk about web archive to researcher, often they think about archive on the web other than archiving the web. So that's quite a big mismatch.
Quite a big difference, isn't it? Yeah. So that's another one of those sort of key terms or terminologies about archive that we can easily misinterpret depending on our perspective. So thank you for that. Got us nicely warmed up, I think. So as digital research infrastructure professionals, we work with scientists, engineers, and all sorts of other scholars. Now, contentiously, you may not agree with these distinctions here, but there's an opportunity to have a fight about that later on, I'm sure. Science, one interpretation is that science is mainly focused on discovery, whereas engineering is mainly focused on design or design and implementation. So, is a design project actually research? Do engineers do scientific research? Have we got any engineers in the room? Just as a matter of interest. Just one, okay. Well, that again is another question, isn't it? So that's my third point there. What is research software engineering as distinct from engineering, and where does computer science fit into all of this? So I guess depending on the time of day or the day of the week, those of us that are digital research infrastructure professionals may call ourselves engineers one day, we may call ourselves scientists the next, we may call ourselves computer scientists on another day, each with a slightly different interpretation and practical experience of the world. So let's think a little bit more about computing, computer science, and IT, information technology. So I'm a computer scientist, really. Many of my scientific colleagues do refer to my domain, computer science, as IT. Exactly, and it gives me the heebie-jeebies. It really does, because they are two entirely different things. But of course, to a chemist, to a biologist, to a humanities scholar, they are indistinct. There is no difference. Some even ask this question, do computer scientists actually do research? Surely you're just there to support my research. So I think there's a distinction between the two. So the question was there, is there a distinction between computer science and scientific computing? And yes, I think there is a distinct difference between the two. And there's a distinction between computer science and computing as well, and one that we could spend, if there's any more computer scientists in the room, we could probably spend the best part of the week arguing over that, and we still wouldn't come to a conclusion. So I'm not drifting around. What I'm intending to make the point here, and a few people are making the point for me, is that there is a very almost tribal understanding of terminology, that as digital research infrastructure professionals, we've got to be able to see the full picture and be able to deal with each of these situations as they occur. And then a final thought about data. So many of us, especially in deep learning and machine learning, work with simulations and simulated data all the time. And as far as we're concerned, it's data, it's proper data. But to many experimental scientists, simulation data or simulated data, they'd be laughed out the coffee club. It's not real because it didn't occur, it wasn't measured in a laboratory or a workshop. So even something as innocuous as talking about data can open up these tribal distinctions. So, this will be the fun bit. Let's talk a little bit about, we've talked about research software engineers, research infrastructure engineers, and we know even in our sort of very broad community, there's a bit of a gap in understanding sometimes. But within our institutions, we also work alongside and often part of enterprise IT. Now, none of this is intended to be a sort of knock IT conversation. I'm sure you have those conversations on your own, and we'll do over coffee anyway. But it's about how we can start to understand within our changing institutions the role of enterprise IT and how we can help enterprise IT as digital research infrastructure professionals understand what the role of a university is. As I'm sure many of us know, many people who come into enterprise IT do so from the private sector, and the private sector where they will have had no exposure to or involvement in research, teaching, or any form of scholarly activity. And I think we would probably all agree, and those of us that have worked in the private sector as well, that they're very, very different beasts. And it's about helping us all go on a journey together to help us do what we're all good at, which is research and teaching. And that's what our universities are here for. So can we coexist? So nothing like a bit of controversy on a Monday afternoon. Now, sort of enterprise IT often aims for this sort of 5 nines, almost 100% availability. Everything's reliable, nothing ever fails. It's incredibly secure. We use established technology, incredibly secure. And maybe they've got a point. There have been a few universities recently subject to some rather nasty cybersecurity incidents, so maybe they've got a point. We've all seen multi-factor authentication added to our phones and other apps recently to keep us nice and safe and sound. Established technology. Okay, so we buy technology stacks off a vendor and we're ultra happy with it. And we're using all these industry best practices, and as Alan said earlier on, all those certifications. All of our enterprise IT people have got a bucket of those, and it's all fine, there's no downtime. But research computing, what are we? Well, we're not bothered if sometimes it doesn't work. It's all a bit experimental. Our whole purpose is to try and be fast and flexible and perhaps agile in the truest term. That we use, and we try to use, cutting edge technology, so we often don't mind it being a bit broken. So if we're discussing as a research software engineer and as a researcher, you want to try something new, I want to try something new, and we sort of expect it might not work first time, probably won't work second time, but we'll fettle around a little bit until we actually get something that works. Because to my research colleague, it's a new way of asking a new question. So we've got to expect a little bit of iteration around the answer. And as we saw earlier on, in some cases, and probably in most cases, there's no such thing as best practice. There are so few of us that we're making up these best practices. We're developing these best practices, sometimes informed by what goes on in the private sector, sometimes informed by best practices in computational and scientific research, but quite a lot of the time we just make it up on the hoof. And that's where communities like this are incredibly important, incredibly useful, because if we can talk to each other and formalise some of these practices and make them into community practice or best practice. How are we doing for time? We're good. So perhaps one way of thinking about this is that we're in this fantastically powerful position within our universities. Perhaps research computing can be the enterprise testbed. Enterprise IT cannot afford to make mistakes, and they probably can't afford to experiment either. They certainly can't afford to do research. They're completely invested into providing this super stable environment for the university. You know, your VLE's always got to work. We're probably a little less bothered if some of the interesting cloud-based pipelines that we've been developing suddenly fail. You know, it's not going to be the end of the day. It's not going to be the end of the world. But perhaps one way of thinking about it, and perhaps one way of getting this conversation going within our institutions, is that those technologies that are currently being adopted and tried out by research computing, I hate the term cutting edge, but new stuff, interesting stuff, and new implementations could well be enterprise requirements in a few years' time. So perhaps one way of going into this is, instead of enterprise IT doing as perhaps in many institutions it is at the moment, careful of my language here, trying to force research computing into its own mould. Perhaps what we want to try and do is say, look, let us make these mistakes. We have to make these mistakes. It's the very nature of research is to make mistakes. But use these observations and let us help you develop best practices for future developments in enterprise IT. And let's not be afraid of making mistakes. I think most of us probably aren't afraid of making mistakes. Most of us make mistakes on a daily basis.
Some researchers can take several years.
Several years to do... And that is a very valid point, which I hope we can pick up in the panel session next. Is that the sort of turnaround, the iteration in our research computing world is probably quite fast in developing new tools and ideas. It might be in the order of weeks or months, maybe up to a year or two. And my friend here on the front table said, but in quite a lot of domains, our research colleagues spend a career, spend a lifetime on one problem. So there's a massive difference in timescale here. And that, again, I think is part of that understanding gap, that mindset gap that we've got to try and address, is that we're talking about one very sort of focused element here about research software engineering problems and research infrastructure problems, and how do we fit our timescales into what might be those career level timescales for those research problems. And I don't have an answer to that, but I'm hoping that's a question that we can bring up in the next panel. So Alan started to talk about this point a little bit earlier on, that, you know, in the olden days, 15 years ago, we probably said that our typical new cyber infrastructure, that's the new trendy term, by the way, got to be cyber, that's the one with the ballet pumps, remember. The new cyber infrastructure user came from a Windows desktop or a laptop background. Now, those days are long gone. Okay, so there are some younger people in the room who perhaps, you know, their colleagues might say that, you know, our typical new user now comes from a tablet or a phone background. That was their first experience of a computational device. The mic's gone. I told you, waving it around. Thank you for keeping me on track. So yeah, our typical new user comes from an iOS or an Android background. And I think back to the first experience that I had of a computer in 1978 when I went to secondary school. You can work out my age from that. Was the local council used to allow the computer club to write programs in BASIC on squared paper. We sent them off to the council, and they came back a week later with the program itself on punch tape, and the outputs are printed out from a dot matrix printer. And then after Christmas, the start of 1979, the first computer that we fought over, I mean, there were literally fistfights over this. The school had one Tandy TRS-80 computer. Now, some of us of a similar vintage might be able to remember those. But these are very, very different devices. So my experience, my sort of computational history and background is very, very different to someone who's perhaps in the 20s or 30s today. And I think for perhaps people of my generation, it's really hard for me to understand that you've not had that experience. And similarly, people who are in their 20s and 30s now, fast forward yourself 20 years' time when you'll be doing a sort of similar job, who knows what people are going to be coming along with. So we've got to try and continually explore the mindset of ourselves and of researchers as well. So anyway, my question was, how has that changed our job? And I think here we've got a question of perhaps what we call mental distance. And there's a huge gap between someone who's used to using a handheld device and someone who's more than happy with using a Linux computer, command line, remote, shared, batch computing. There's a massive gap between those people. And Alan made this point earlier on that we used to see people, you know, those CFD researchers who were a bit crusty and they were really used to using Linux computers. They were more than happy. The gap between running Fluent on your Linux computer compared to a HPC cluster was relatively small. But now we've got PhD students and postdocs who perhaps have been more used to using an Apple tablet. So how do we help them on that journey? Installing software, that's just one example. Installing software. It's out the App Store, isn't it? That's all you do. But we still perhaps expect a lot of our HPC users, very specific example here, HPC users, to be able to build and install their own software. Perhaps they get some help from research software engineers or infrastructure engineers. But, you know, why can't you compile that piece of C++ or Fortran? Why can't you use SPAC or EasyBuild? If they're very unlucky, well, if they're very lucky, they might be able to follow the instructions you give them. If they're very lucky, if they're very unlucky or just normal, they'll look at it and have a complete case of the heebie-jeebies. It's incredibly difficult. It's a massive gap. It's a massive gap. And I think, is it realistic to expect all of our users to be able to do this? And I think the answer to that is probably no. So again, this is an opportunity for another little three or 4 minute break. So here's another discussion on your tables. So I'm sure many of you have come across situations like that before, where there's a mindset gap between where people come to research computing, come to cloud, come to HPC, and where they are at the moment. And I'm just wondering if you can share with us some of those examples, some of those mindset gaps that you've seen or you've experienced. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes again, table conversation, and this is an opportunity for a discussion about mindset gaps. Similarly, if you're on Meet, so you've got that opportunity to post a few things in the chat, a couple of bullet points, a couple of thoughts about this mindset gap and your experiences of that. And I'll hand over to the AirMeet people first of all. So I'm going to set my timer for 3 minutes and give you a little opportunity for a chat about that. And we'll be back in 3 minutes' time. Right, okay, thanks very much, folks. Let us draw our attention back to the front. So one discussion was about mindset gap. So Nikki's going to start off with a couple of interesting examples from our AirMeet discussion. So just over to you, Nikki, to begin with.
Taught some undergrads, and they were unable to understand the concept of storing files on their home drive, and there was no concept of that with a tablet. And a classic, apparently.
Classic,
Somebody comes
yes.
to you with, it's not working. And you ask, well, was there an error message? What did it say? Oh, I didn't read it.
So, I mean, error messages themselves are an interesting one, and I'm sure we've all seen some classics with scientific software that are perhaps less than helpful at the best of times, let's put it like that. So I've pre-picked a couple of tables to give us a little bit of an example. So the table right at the very back to begin with Katerina and Simon on it. We're also going to choose this table as well.
Cool. So an example from our table was that although some users might be familiar with programming in certain environments, so MATLAB or Jupyter notebooks, then that doesn't necessarily translate to command line interfaces, even if they're perfectly proficient in the area they're used to.
Yep, that's a good one. Thanks very much indeed. And this table over with Phil. Thank you.
So
well volunteered, Phil.
Thank you. Just to pick one, actually picking up from that, the idea that when you want to run something, you don't just click on an icon somewhere. You've got to open the terminal. The what? Terminal sounds like something bad, right? You know, you've got terminal disease, terminal illness. So terminal sounds like it's stopping, not something you start. Why would I start something that's terminal?
Weird, eh? Yeah, absolutely. So there's some really good examples, and yet really good examples of these mental distance gaps, these mindset gaps that we, at various stages in our career, have got to try and work with. And this is going to continue to happen, and these gaps are probably going to get wider. Okay, that's really cool. So during that little intermission there, so Alan reminded me of another point as well. About perhaps thinking about why enterprise IT is why it is. Because our enterprise IT departments are cost sensitive, okay? And that's an important consideration. It has to work all the time, and it has to work all the time at the lowest possible cost. So a little bit of a plug again for our unconference session on Wednesday afternoon, when there is an opportunity to sort of throw those discussion topics over to the audience as a whole. Talking to a few people over lunch, there are certainly a few in the room who would like to be able to discuss how we work more effectively with enterprise IT and how we help them understand what it is that we do. Okay. 10 minutes or so left. So on to my last little phase, which I hope we'll have a chance for another little catch-up discussion just at the end. So a little thought then, which I think should be a nice lead-in to Sarah's panel discussion next, is just have a little bit of a think about what motivates researchers and academics. And do you know what? Most of us probably know this already, but it doesn't hurt to remind ourselves what it is that motivates researchers, what it is that motivates academics, and perhaps a little bit of why they are what they are, why they say what they say, and why they do what they do. So please feel free to disagree or agree with any of this, but this is a perspective. So typically, academic staff at research institutions are rewarded for maybe three things. Sort of bringing in grant money, publishing papers or other academic scholarly activity, and teaching students. Okay? You know, there might be others. Managing, the more senior you get as well. But for you know, your average early mid-career researcher, it's income, papers, students. So academics generally aren't bothered about IT. They're bothered about having good IT, and IT that works all the time. But if you're responsible for a grant, it's a fixed amount of money from your research funder. That's all you've got. If somebody comes back to you later on and says, well, the cost's gone up, you can't go back to your funder and say, well, can I have an extra £100,000, please? Doesn't happen, does it? Because your funder's likely to say, well, that's nice for you. What do you want me to do about it? So in many cases, academics will prefer not to pay more than the absolute minimum for their computing. And don't forget, and I've heard this so many times, that the average mental model for what compute costs and storage costs is what you can get from PC World. You know, so why am I spending more than £650 on a laptop? I can go to PC World and buy that today. Why does Enterprise IT tell me it costs 1,400 quid and I can't have it for 2 months? You know, why can't I buy a 70 quid USB storage device, 4 terabytes for 70 quid? And my Enterprise IT department wants to charge me £100 per terabyte per year. Why the difference? And not only that, but I forgot to put any of these costs on my grant because I didn't know I had to include them. I sort of assumed it was all free. So let's move on a little bit. So let's think of our lecturers and academics then as one group of academics. Not everybody's the same. So perhaps there's a slightly different incentive in structure here. Got to publish lots of papers, again. Got to bring in lots of grant money. Got to teach lots of students. I won't get a rise. I won't get a promotion. And I won't get any other prestigious outcomes. I've got to do all of these three things. I've got to do it now, and I don't want the grief of IT. I need my stuff to be working now. I need it to keep working reliably. So if you're not involved in teaching, but you're a researcher, a postdoc, if I don't bring in grant money or deliver on my grants, my contract doesn't get renewed. Remember that most postdocs are on fixed-term contracts. It's an incredibly stressful experience to be a postdoc. I've got to publish. If I'm on a 2-year contract, I've got to get a paper out before the end of my first year, or I'm not going to get my contract renewed. And in fact, not only will I not get my contract renewed, I might not get a job anywhere else. So when our IT departments don't have a working computer and we don't have conversations with our postdoc colleagues within a week or 2 of them starting, they're already disadvantaged. Think about postdocs more generally. Junior postdoc, excuse me. I need to publish a lot or I'll lose my postdoc position. If you're a junior postdoc, not only have you got to deliver on your grant, you've got to work out how to write grants yourself, because it would be really nice to be able to have a job and pay the rent and or mortgage at some point. I might even like to get a permanent position, but it takes a few postdocs to get good enough to be in the position to get a permanent position. And if you're on a fixed term contract, you always need it to work, and it's got to work now, and it's always got to work. And if you're a research student, first goal, to finish a PhD. Anything that delays my graduation costs me money. This is costing me an absolute fortune being a PhD student. If I'm really lucky, I might have some income. Won't be a huge amount. I might be working in a pub, might be a teaching assistant, I might be a demonstrator, might be all three, you know. And I'm trying to do a PhD, and I'm trying to finish it in 3 years. Okay. While I'm doing my PhD, I am giving up that many years of salary and other benefits. So most PhD students see this as an absolute investment in their future career. But again, I need my IT, and that's not just enterprise IT, it's our IT as well, to always work. I need it to be here right now. And remember, any delay means that it's even more stress on these people. So that's a thought or two about why researchers are why they are, and why they say what they say, and why quite a lot of researchers seem quite stressed a lot of the time, because it's an incredibly stressful experience. And I haven't mentioned this, but you know, I think, as we know, most of our research colleagues teach, and teach a lot as well. So the time to do this, there's relatively little time in their timetable to be a full-time researcher as well as being a full-time teacher. So, final thoughts, and again, perhaps a lead into where we go next. Being an academic is really tough. Our job, I think one of the responsibilities of our job as research software engineers and and research infrastructure engineers is to try and make that time a little bit less tough. Okay. Research income is really hard won. It's very hard to get grant income, and 35% success rate's probably quite good. So that means, for every 3 grants you write, you might only get 1 awarded. You might get less than that. And that is no reflection at all on the quality of the proposal or the quality of the research. And I'm sure those of us that have been involved in grants, it's incredibly disappointing. It knocks your confidence. It really, really knocks your confidence when a grant isn't awarded, when you know it's a superb proposal. And increasingly, even in research-intensive institutions as well, there's massive pressure on providing an excellent undergraduate experience too. So double the pressure. Okay, so that's probably my sort of parting thoughts there. It is almost past, so I think we're due for a break at past. I think that's right, coffee break at past. You're nodding your head. Is that right? You think so? Good. So there's an opportunity to have a think about some of those thoughts. Also, if there are any sort of final questions or comments from the audience, we can hold that open to the audience now. My colleagues with microphones will dash to you to allow you to do so. And if anybody wants to pass on any comments from Meet as well for another couple of minutes, then we'll break for coffee, and then it's the first of the panel activities at 3 o'clock. So for me, thank you very much. If you've got any questions, just stick your hand up, or any comments you want to make, just stick your hand up and one of our mic colleagues will attend to you. Go on, we've got one of those. Simon on the back row there.
Thank you. That's quite thought-provoking. I'm going to add another thought onto that, if I may. The researchers and just PhD students who are having difficulty with IT, part of the problem, I think, is that they're thinking of it like IT, which is the thing that enables you to do your timesheets and send your emails. Whereas really, I think it would be helpful if they viewed what they were doing with research computing as an in silico experiment and view it as an academic activity and not an IT service. Just throwing that out there for people.
That's a very useful and interesting perspective, Simon. Thank you. We've got one more here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on the sort of mental gap coming from a slightly younger and inexperienced perspective. Just being that it's quite intimidating, actually, quite the gap between how much you've got to learn. It feels quite intimidating when you first start, that you've got all these things that you need to know about that you don't know, and then suddenly you're being asked and told, oh, your research depends on this, your degree depends on getting this done. So it can be quite intimidating, yeah. I think it's just worth bearing in mind when you're dealing with somebody that it is an intimidating prospect for them.
So thank you for making that point. I think that is a really important point. Perhaps from 2 perspectives. Is perhaps people, those of us who are a little bit older, have had the opportunity to absorb all of that. We've grown up with the gap, as it were. We've had 40 odd years to be able to learn what all of this means. You're perhaps trying to condense 40 years of development into 6 months at the start of a postdoc, which is quite hard work, isn't it? And I think as well that perhaps something that is worth reminding ourselves of as well, and I made this point about pressure and stress, is that there are, I think, quite significant mental health implications for our research colleagues as well, about things not working when they need to work and the stress that all of this imposes on people. And I'm hoping that perhaps during the course of the week we can think a little bit about the impact that has on people as well. Stress is quite difficult to deal with, and it's an incredibly difficult situation that people find themselves in. I think it's much harder now than it used to be. And I hope we can all think about how we can go on a journey and learn and develop together in a supportive way. I think if there's any one more? No. Oh, go on.
Yeah, I just think like a lot of your comments on sort of how why academics are the way they are and why researchers are the way they are. I think it kind of shows that it all comes down to sort of working conditions. Like a lot of people go into research and go into all of these fields out of passion and out of interest, and then you're forced by kind of just difficult working conditions, circumstance into making kind of slightly cynical careerist moves. And I think, I don't know, I feel like a kind of more of a sense of community between us working together. We can work to improve our working conditions, and in doing so kind of therefore benefit the research environment as a whole, as well as benefiting ourselves, I think.
So that's a really good point to break on before lunch. So supporting each other to benefit ourselves and improve working conditions for everybody, I think is a really good take home. So thank you very much for that comment. That's cool. So it is just past 1:30. I've stolen 3 minutes of your coffee break, for which I apologise profusely. So that's it, 2:30. Back at 3 o'clock for the next activity of the afternoon. Thank you very much indeed, everybody.